Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. How are you doing? Yeah? How was the fast? Last week we fasted for 3 days. How many of you took part in the fast? Anyone? Great. That's most of us. That was so cool. Was it a good time? Yeah?
Worst days of my life.
Worst days of your life. But we don't know you yet fully. We want to know you better and better. And so we just pray, God, that this morning, the result of being together, the result of singing, the result of praying, the result of listening to your word being read and taught would be that we would know you better. And as we get to know you better, we would just trust you more. In the same way that as we get to know a friend better, we trust them more, or a parent better, we trust them more. We just pray, God, that as we get to know you better, we would trust you more. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. We are back in the book of Genesis right at the beginning. So if you have the Bible with you, you can turn to Genesis chapter 15. I will give a little bit of an intro, and then we'll jump into that. So we're continuing on. Brett mentioned we're going to continue on in the story of Abraham. And the story of Abraham is really a story of faith. And many of us refer to Christians as people of faith. You've probably heard that before. And I just have been reflecting on that and realized that everyone's a person of faith, right? Every single person who exists in the world lives by faith. They just live by faith in different things. So an illustration of this, when I was in high school, my high school teacher was a little feisty, and he was funny, and he was great, my favorite teacher of all time. But he was like, how many of you believe in Catalina, that Catalina exists? And we all grew up so we could see Catalina. And we raised our hands. He's like, how many of you have been there? And maybe 3 or 4 of us have actually been there. And then he's like, then why do you believe in it? And we're like, well, because we've seen pictures. And he's like, okay, what else? And he's like, well, friends have told us about it. He's like, so you don't actually know that Catalina exists, do you? You just believe pictures. And you believe your friends. But you don't know for sure, do you? And he meant it as like I'm going to rip down faith. Like faith is silly. Like how can you trust something like that? But I saw it the other way and I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like so much of life really is faith. So much of my life is really just trusting what other people have said, trusting other people who are out there, and just believing generally that I just live by, that person, I've never studied that before, but I trust them. And I've never looked into that before, but I trust them. Right? I mean, obviously, like COVID was a great example of that, right? Like you had a lot of people saying, I don't trust this type of person. I don't trust that type of person. When someone's asking me to do something that I consider big, I have to trust a lot who it is. And we had a division in our culture, not over much else other than trust. One group of people trusted this group. Another group of people trusted that group. But none of us were actually doing experiments on our own, right? You weren't testing things out on your own. You were just like, no, that group of people seems trustworthy. And therefore, I'm going to follow what they say. We do it all the time. Everyone who has ever existed has been a person of faith, right? We think that is true also, specifically in the realm of faith, the realm of believing like spirituality and stuff like that. But not just Christians live by faith. Everyone who's out there has some sort of faith and some sort of spiritual world out there. I've told you this story before, but I was talking to a friend of mine, a neighbor of mine once, and he made some comment, the universe is kind to me. And I was like, really? How do you know that? And he was like, well, my life's been really good. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Well, what happens when your life's not good, buddy? Is the universe switching on you and suddenly is now really mean to you? When is it possible to just believe that the universe is kind? Only when life is really good. And secondly, when the universe isn't asking much of you. Right? The universe never challenges you to do something that's not culturally appropriate. Right? Not something that everyone else would want to do anyway. Now that's where it gets really challenging for Christians, right? Because in Christianity has a really high bar, really high challenge rate, where God, Jesus, is going to ask you to do things that are very countercultural. And so what you need to be able to do that thing, to be able to take that risk and do that really challenging thing, is you need to have a pretty high bar of faith before you could do something that's really challenging to what the culture expects you to do. How are you going to get there? How are you going to get to the spot where you're able to say, no one would ever do this thing, but I'm going to do it. No one's going to be able to do this challenge that God's going to challenge me to do. How are you going to get there? How are you going to grow your faith enough to where you can take a huge risk only because you trust God and you trust who Jesus is? How are you going to get there? That's what Genesis 15 is about. God is going to help us build our faith so that we can take massive risks for the sake of something that he wants for us that's bigger and better than anything that this world has to offer. God's going to build our faith. That's what Genesis 15 is about. Okay, so just to refresh you, because it's been a couple of weeks, we're reading about the story of Abraham. Abraham's really important in the Bible. In chapters 12 and 13 of Genesis, God makes huge promises to Abraham. He says, I'm going to give you thousands and thousands of acres of property. I'm going to give you such blessing, material, physical, emotional, social, spiritual, relational blessing, that you are literally going to bless every family on the globe throughout history. And I'm going to give you thousands upon thousands of children, which may not sound like a blessing, unless you're Luke, right? Sounds like a blessing, doesn't it? But in their world, that was a big deal, and everybody liked that, and they're like, yeah, I want 1,000 kids. That would be wonderful. Okay, so God's offering all of that, right? Now, if you jump into chapter 14, Abraham has his first opportunity to grab that blessing. He wins the war. He wins a little battle, and as a result of winning that battle, it was the opportunity for him to take the land. So he was being offered by God, like literally billions of dollars worth of property. He wins this battle, and now it's his chance. He can totally take this billions of dollars worth of property as his own if he wants to. But he chooses not to. How many of us would have the faith to leave $1 billion on the table and walk away from it? No. No. Very few of us would. Chapter 15 opens with God saying this to Abraham. Chapter 15, verse 1. After these things, after Abraham left $1 billion on the table, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. What would he be afraid of in this moment? That he made a huge mistake. Are you kidding me? I just left that to go over here. And God's looking at him like, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Look, it's a huge risk. And while you're waiting for me to answer and give you what I promised you, you are going to feel nervous. You are going to feel doubt. You're going to feel uncertain. You're going to feel like, am I just the biggest idiot in the world? I cannot believe I passed that up. And he's like, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't freak out. Like, such a good God knows you kind of moment in the Bible that the first thing he says is, don't freak out right now. Don't be afraid. I'm your shield, which means I'm going to protect you. I'm going to provide for you. Your reward shall be very great. So now he's basically looking at what Abraham has left on the table, and it says, you are going to get something better than what you left. Don't freak out. And this is just a beautiful thing because God is going to ask each of us to make huge steps of faith, and he is fully aware that we are going to be afraid while we're doing it. That's actually the definition of faith. Faith is not absolute confidence all the time that nothing could possibly go wrong. Faith always means you have doubt. You have to have doubt, otherwise it's not faith. And he's basically saying to you, you're going to freak out because you have faith. You're going to have concern because you have faith and you're taking a risk. It's going to cost you something. Don't freak out. God is going to provide for you. So now, when you're taking this huge step of faith and you're walking towards Jesus and you're walking away from what the world wants for you, you're going to have a big temptation. And that big temptation is to lower your standards. Lower your standards from what God has laid out for you, God's promises for you, down to something that's manageable according to human abilities. Right? That's what every human being goes through. Listen to what Abraham goes through. Verse 2, but Abram said to God, oh, Lord God, what are you going to give me? I still don't have any kids. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you've given me no children, and a member of my household will be my heir. Let's see, he's looking at his life right now, and he's basically saying, it's not working. God, you have made these promises, and it's not working. God, you promised me that I was going to have lots and lots and lots of kids, but I'm pushing 80, my wife is too, and we don't have any kids yet. It doesn't look like it's working. You've promised me a huge inheritance. It doesn't look like I've got that yet. Now, in their culture, it was totally legit for you to pass your inheritance down to one of your workers. So Eliezer is one of his employees. This guy had grown up, born and raised in Abraham's house. And so this kid, this Eliezer guy, would have felt like family. He would have done all holidays together. They would have had thousands of meals together. And so he would have felt like family. So in that sense, Abram could have passed it on to Eliezer. It was legitimate. And in their culture, they would have been like, that's fine. But at the same time, Abram would have had a nagging sense inside of him like, God, your promise was huge. And if it works out this way, that's kind of like, okay. It's fine, I guess. That'll be okay. A lowering of a standard to a human level. Have you seen people do that before? Where God has an ideal for them, they wait for a while, and then they settle for something less than ideal? Can you think of an example where people do that? Where's an area where people often, there's a standard that God has, and they have waited just a little too long, and they're like, I just can bring it down a notch. Marriage. Thank you. That happens all the time, doesn't it? I mean, I did college and young adult ministry for a long time, and I don't know how many couples I had to counsel and be like, you guys should break up. Right? Right? Because God's like, hey, look, I want you to marry someone who is going to be on fire for the Lord, someone who's going to lift your faith, someone who's going to strengthen you, someone who you can be on mission together with. And if you wait in your 20s, you're like, yeah, I'm all about that. I'm waiting. Then you get to your late 20s, you're like, well, maybe they just kind of like the Lord. That'd be okay. Then you get in your 30s and you're like, if they show up to the church once a year, that's fine with me. Right? And then after, it's like, no, God, I have no standards at all. They're nice. That's all I'm looking for, right? It happens, doesn't it? And we settle and we're like, well, look, if I wait longer, God's just not going to come through. If I wait longer, God's not going to be able to fulfill this promise. If I wait longer, I'm going to be alone. I'm going to be sad. If I wait, well, who am I supposed to trust if I can't trust myself to figure this out? What God is going to offer to Abraham is a challenge, and that challenge is you better be ready to wait. If you wait, you will not have a human story. You will have a God story. And if you don't wait for the God story for the rest of your life, you're going to look back and be like, oh, can't believe I did that. Or worse. Right? Happens all the time. Wait for the God story. Look at what God says in the next lines. Verse 5. And he brought him outside. This is God brought Abram outside and said, look toward heaven. Number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to them, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Walk outside with me, Abram. Look up in the night sky. That's how many kids you're going to have. Sounds like a nightmare to some of us. It was Abraham, it was glory. It's like, oh, man. I don't know if you've seen 101 Dalmatians, but when he finds out how many kids he's going to have, he's like, oh, so great. That's how Abram would have felt as well. Like, this is a huge, huge, huge promise. Now, Abram was being challenged to, or tested really to lower his standards down to a human manageable level, God takes him outside and says, why not instead raise your standards far beyond anything you can imagine, far beyond anything that's humanly possible. There is literally no way Abram can make this happen on his own. Right? So if God offers you a promise, if God is making a promise to you, and you say to yourself, I'm just kind of tired of waiting for God, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, I'm going to make this happen, and you kind of jump the gun, you have to lower the standard in order to do that. There's no other way. So you think about that. Like if God had offered Abram billions of dollars worth of property, and Abram's like, okay, I'm going to do it myself. He was a pretty good warrior. And he could have gone out, and he probably could have fought a few different battles. And he probably could have won. He probably could have got a good amount of the land. There's no way he could have won all the land in his life. He was already an old man. But beyond that, God had promised him countless children already, and he was too old. And so he literally could not fulfill the promises of God on his own. He could not make it happen. He had to wait for God to do this. So what God is offering to him is he's saying, look, rather than trying to make it happen on your own, you must wait for a miracle. You must wait for God to intervene. And that takes a lot of faith, right? If you're waiting for that spouse, or you're waiting for that house, or you're waiting for that better job, or you're waiting for something else, very often what you have to wait for is literally a miracle. And that means you can't trust yourself in the process. You really have to say, it's out of my hands. It is out of my control. I can't do this on my own. I'll give you a quick illustration. So Kimmy and I were looking for a place to live. This was a few years ago. And she was looking for houses and looking and looking. Quite obsessed, I would say. Yeah, quite obsessed, right. I was currently unemployed, so looking for houses, maybe that was the miracle. She keeps looking, and I was like, Kimmy, we're wasting our time. But whatever, anyway, she kept looking, and she'd find a house. She'd get super excited about it. And she'd be like, oh, my gosh, this is the house. And I'd be like, Kimmy, that's like $200,000 out of our price range. It's not in the city we want to live in. And it's got so much work that it needs to be done. Like, there's no way we can move into a house like that. I don't even have a job. Anyway, that went on. And we didn't find a house, right? And she never went for it. And then she waited. And by God's grace, she lived through nervousness and anxiety and fear. And what if we never get a house? And what if we have to live in my parents' house forever? And what if this happens? And what if that happens? And what if that lives through that for about a year or so? And then God gives us a house. It's a miracle. That was like cheaper than anything in the neighborhood we were going to live in. By God's gift of a miracle, it's actually an affordable house. Absolute miracle. We could tell you details of how miraculous it was, but it just shows that sometimes God, if he's working a plan out, that we have to be patient. And she probably waited 6 months to a year longer than she really wanted to wait. But ultimately, she got a God story out of it. And now every time we talk about that house, we don't talk about, oh my gosh, we were so good. We were so diligent. We were looking, and then we found it, and then we got all of our ducks in a row, and we made it happen. That's not the story we tell. The story was, oh, can you believe? God did this and this and this and this and this, and now we live there. You need a God story as well. And that's what God is offering to Abram. You want a God story. You want some way that you can point back and say, God did that. I waited, and God did that. And look at how Abram responds. Verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and God counted it to Abram as righteousness. Abram believed God, and God said he's righteous. This is one of the most important sentences ever written, especially in the Old Testament. This is one that gets repeated very often in the New Testament. This is kind of the core of what Christianity ends up being about in a way. It's the core of what a believing life looks like. If you want to memorize a verse, memorize this one. And let me just explain it just a little bit to you. He believed the Lord, and God considered Abram righteous because of his faith. So what does it mean to believe in this moment? In this moment, belief for Abram, he had faith. Some of your translations will say he had faith and God considered his faith to be righteous or something like that. We sometimes think of faith as I agree to kind of a creed or like a list of beliefs, and I have these beliefs about God. But that can't be what it means right now, because Abram knew hardly anything about God at this point. He knew that God was the creator, and knew that God had to punish humanity a few different times because they're just ridiculously monstrous to each other. And he knew that God wanted to bless the world. But other than that, he didn't really know a ton about God yet. What belief means in this moment is actually just a posture in his heart, a softness to learn about God and continue obeying God as he learns about who God is. Right? In that sense, it's kind of like an arranged marriage. You're committed to this person, knowing that you're going to learn a lot later. That's kind of what it was like for Abraham. He's got a posture of saying, okay, I'm committed. I'm going to learn as we grow. And then God, in response, considers Abram righteous. And we need to define that word as well. When we hear the word righteous, we tend to immediately assume it means right behavior. So that God looked at Abram and considered him to be morally pure or morally good or something like that. But that can't really be what it means in this moment, because God literally has not told Abraham anything about right or wrong yet. You can read the story of Abram's life. God does not say anything about morality yet. The word righteous elsewhere in the Bible can mean a couple of other main things. One is it means justify. And so Abram, our God, just considered him justified or proven, right. So, see, I was justified in believing that the Lakers were the best team ever because they won, that kind of a thing. It can also mean vindicated, like proved you wrong, kind of a thing. Doesn't seem to mean either of those right here. It seems to mean the best word that I could come up with is like qualified or something like that. And that's not even really the right word. But basically, God is looking down at Abraham and saying, I'm going to bless you just because I'm going to bless you. Abram responds in faith, and God says, all right, then you're kind of a worthy vessel to be, your heart is ready, basically. Your posture is right so that I can work in you and so that I can use you. It's a weird thing it's hard to communicate this, so I thought maybe I'd talk about Andrew and Rory for a second. So this is the picture. Andrew, can you hold up the hero? There he is. My guy right there. This is Rory. That's Andrew and Rory. Oh, man, that's a great guy. Okay, so Andrew and Rory are a great example, I think, of being justified by faith or being righteous by faith. So on the day that Rory is born, Andrew, two A's there, because Andrew kisses him, loves him, tells him he loves him, tells him you're the man, you're great, you're my guy. It says all that kind of stuff. Cuddles with him all the time, feeds him, provides for him, all that kind of, just like loving him like crazy. He probably set up a 401k for him already. He's got like a college account going. Andrew, from day one, is fully committed to Rory and loving Rory, right? Now, what's happening in Rory's heart right now? Rory is actually learning to trust this blob that he doesn't even recognize as a human being yet, right? And then it kind of starts to take shape, that Andrew starts to become a person to Rory. And then as Rory begins knowing, like, this is the guy I look to when I have a problem. This being here, this whatever this thing is, if I'm hungry, this thing helps. This thing, if I needed to be changed, this thing. If I have a problem, this thing can help me out. And his understanding of who Andrew is developing right now. It's maturing. Andrew has not yet told Rory anything about right or wrong. He doesn't know, he has no moral compass whatsoever at this point. All he knows is there's a being out there that is willing to help me out when I've got an issue. He's learning to trust. And that's kind of what's going on with Abram's life right now too. That he is learning how to trust God, because God is saying, I'm committed to you. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to surround you. I'm going to be your shield. And Abram's picture of what God is like is only starting to come into focus a little bit. That when he's got an issue, he knows he can turn to God, even though he doesn't know much about God. Now, later in life, Andrew is going to tell Rory the difference between right and wrong, and Rory is going to respond with obedience. I'm prophesying that because he trusts Andrew. He has learned to trust Andrew long before he knew right or wrong, right? And similarly, Abram is later going to be told right or wrong by God, and he's going to say, you know what, I'll do that because I trust who you are. You've already proven yourself that you want to provide for me. You're going to take care of me. That's what it means to be justified by faith. To be righteous by faith means that your heart posture already has an openness to God to say, I don't know you perfectly yet, but when I've got an issue, I'm turning to you. And when I've got a question, I'm turning towards you. And as I learn things about you, I am going to appreciate those things and love those things. And when you start telling me how to live my life, because I already trust you, I'm going to follow the way of life that you're laying out for me. And God's going to look down and say, that kind of person, I'm blessing that kind of person. That type of person, that's my son, that's my daughter. That's someone I know. That if God were simply rewarding Abram because he was a good person, a nice person, or something like that, he would be an employee who's getting a paycheck, right? But God is not the cosmic employer in the sky. He's a father. And what that means is he's going to love you before you know who he is. He's going to take care of you before you know who he is. And he's going to help you trust him by providing for you long before you care anything about him. You with me? Okay. Abram knew a little bit about God. There was a little bit. That's verse 7. God says to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. So he's reminding him that I called you and I committed to you to be your father. I called you out into this journey. And Abram responds, he says, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? I love statements like this because we know that Abram has faith, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have questions, right? How am I supposed to know? And this is the big deal that we all have all the time. Like, I know you make promises, God, but how is it supposed to work out? How are you going to solve this issue, God? And that's the question that we need to be answered. And the way that God responds is really powerful, a little bit confusing, but really powerful. God responds by saying two things. Number one, I'm going to write a contract with you. A covenant. I'm going to make a covenant with you, which is a promise, guarantee. I'm going to guarantee, put it in writing kind of a thing, that I am fully committed to you, and I'm going to give you everything I said I'm going to give you. And then secondly, God says, you can trust me. You can know for sure that you're going to get this because I'm putting some skin in the game, putting my own life on the line to guarantee that you will get what I'm promising you. Two reasons that you can trust me. So let's read this, a little bit obscure from our vantage point, but it made a lot of sense to Abram in his day. So I'll explain. How will I know? Verse 8 one more time. How will I know that I'm going to possess it? And God says in verse 9, he said to him, bring me a heifer, that's a lady cow. Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these. He cut them in half and laid each half over against the other. So he is essentially bringing 5 or however many there are sacrificial animals. We're going to come to learn more about these sacrificial animals when we get into Leviticus, which we're not going through together, by God's grace. We're not going to go through this together. He cuts them in half, so he makes these 5 sacrifices. And he cuts them in half, and he lays them side by side. So one half of the cow over here, the other half over here, one half of the goat here, the other half over here. Right. He didn't cut the birds in half. They're too small. When birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Okay. Verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. So he fell asleep. Behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. What does that mean? God says, you can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am going to do what I promised to do for you, period. However, it's going to take 400 years. How old is Abraham planning to live? Not 400 more, okay? What does that mean? That means I am absolutely going to do what I promised to do for you, Abram, and your family. However, you are not going to see it. Your kids aren't going to see it. Your grandkids, your great-grandkids, your great-great-grandkids, and great-great-great-great-great-great-grandkids, they're not going to see it. But I am going to do it. Abraham in this moment might be thinking, I just left $1 billion of property on the table. And you are telling me now that I'm going to get this, but not in my lifetime or my kid's lifetime. You're going to do this. God, that is an enormous sacrifice. It's a humongous risk. Help me make sense of this, God. Why should I go for this? And essentially what God's answer is Abram, your story is not just your story. Your story is part of a global thing that I'm doing. I have plans and designs for every people group on the planet. And so what's happening in your little life here is actually part of a huge tapestry of things that I am weaving. And so you're going to have to wait because I have got all this stuff that I'm coordinating. The Amorites and the Egyptians and all these other lands. I'm organizing all of these things. So you're going to just have to hold tight for a while. Part of the answer. Abraham may or may not have been happy about that. I'm not sure. When the sun, we keep going, verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of 10 nations with crazy names. All right. God says 2 things in this paragraph in response to Abram, saying to him, you can trust me, build your faith, stretch your faith a bit, build it up, you can trust me. Number 1, he says, I'm going to write a covenant with you. That covenant is a guarantee, Abram, this land belongs to you by gift from God. That's great. That's step number 1. How many of us trust covenants these days? Contracts? Anyone trust their contract anymore? People used to. They used to mean something. Nowadays it's like, I may break it, may not. Who knows? Right? So I don't know where you see contracts and covenants happening, but I listen to sports radio every once in a while, and it feels like every sports contract ever written right now is a worthless piece of junk, right? Like some owner is going to get a new coach for the team, and so they write this contract out together. And the coach is like, I don't trust this thing at all. Like, as soon as I have a losing season, you're going to rip the contract up and fire me. I know it. And so he puts a clause in there, and that clause is, if you fire me before the contract's up, you have to pay me $10 million, right? And basically what he's saying to the owner is, it's going to hurt. It's going to really hurt for you not to keep this contract, right? And the figure of speech that we use now is you got skin in the game, right? It's like you got to put something in this that's going to make it hurt for you. You've got to have some kind of like ownership, some kind of blood, like whatever. It's going to hurt you. We need that kind of stuff to kind of ratchet it up to make sure that people are going to keep contracts with each other. And the same thing was true back in the day. When they wrote contracts, they would essentially put some of their own blood into it. It would cost them a lot. And so what's happening in this story is something kind of earth-shattering in a way. And God is saying to Abram, not only am I going to write this contract to guarantee to you that I'm going to do this thing, but beyond that, I'm going to put a whole lot of my own skin in this game. And so that's what you see with that crazy picture. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. What does that mean? Abram is having a vision right now of these sacrificial animals that have been split in two. And in the vision, there is a flaming pot, or smoking pot, and a flaming torch that goes through them. And that's the answer to, how can I know for sure? See the flaming pot, and that will guarantee whatever. What does it mean? God is initiating this covenant. We've known that from the beginning because he said, get these animals. Do this to them. I'm writing a covenant with you. But it's a little bit further than simply God initiating. It's the next level, which is? He's putting his skin in the game. I'm sorry, what was that?
Abraham can't do anything by himself.
Yeah, we know that Abraham is completely helpless. First of all, he's dead asleep, right? So God is doing this, and you're just laying down, buddy. But also, God is saying, I'm putting my own flesh into this covenant because when ancient covenants were drawn, at least in this ancient world, they would write part of the contract, and it would say, we've sacrificed these animals. May it be to me as it is to these animals if I don't keep my end of the bargain. Flames and fire throughout the Bible are symbolic of God's presence. When God walks through those 5 sacrifices, he is saying, this is me walking into this covenant saying, look at these animals. If I don't do what I say I'm going to do, you can kill me. Now, that would have made some sense in the ancient world if 2 kings were talking to each other because it's easy to kill a king. How do you kill God? How is it possible for God to put his life on the line? In Abraham's day, he would have understood the imagery and what it would have meant, but he could not possibly fathom how it could actually work. There's just no way he could have dreamed that up. We know now, right? We know that everything that happens in Abram's life is not really about Abram. It's always pointing us to Jesus, right? It's always pointing ahead to a time when it actually would be possible for all the promises that God had given to Abram to become a reality for a people. And so if you were to look ahead into the stories where Jesus talks about communion, Jesus says, I want to do something with you. I want to write a new covenant with you. Not like the covenant that you had with Abram and with Moses. It's not going to be a covenant like that. It's going to be a new covenant. And then what does Jesus say when he describes what this covenant is? He says, it's a new covenant in my blood. So rather than us cutting up these animals and laying them aside and letting that be the blood that kind of qualifies and cements and solidifies this covenant, Jesus is saying, it'll be my blood that proves my commitment to blessing people. And what's crazy about it is that God is saying, in Abraham's covenant, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, you can kill me. But in the new covenant, Jesus says, if you don't keep your end of the bargain, I'll die for you. How much more guaranteed is that kind of a covenant? The only one who's in the contract who could actually make a mistake has already been forgiven before they enter into the contract. You can't break a contract like that. Unbreakable at this point. So now when you look and you say, how am I going to have faith to take a risk and to follow God into a promise that seems way beyond anything I can ever do for myself? And I'm going to have to give up what everyone around me wants in order to wait for what God has in store for me. How can I have faith like that? I think the answer of the Bible would be you look to the covenant that Jesus has bought on the cross. that he would always say, look back at the cross, and that should prove to you that God is fully, ultimately committed to giving you everything that he has promised to give you. The way that Romans says it is, how could he who did not spare his own son not with him also graciously give us all things? You look to the cross and you say, God is that committed to blessing me, that he would be willing to die for me. How could I possibly doubt that he's not going to give me everything I need? Right? Pastor Allen from Southlands Brea always has this illustration. He's like, it's like a parent giving you a car for your birthday. That's, let's say it's a Porsche. It's like really nice. And then you're like, this is great. Can I have the keys? And they're like, no. If God, that's impossible, right? That would never happen. If your parents were that committed to generosity, of course they would give you everything else you need. Of course they would give you the keys. Of course they would give you this and that. They would give everything else. If the standard has been set astronomically, of course they're going to give you everything else. Of course they're going to fulfill all the other needs that you have in themselves. That's what the way that God builds our faith is by saying, look at me, look at who I am, who have I proven myself to be? And as you notice who I am, that should strengthen your faith more and more. And then you look at the cross and you say, God has proven himself there, therefore I can also trust him through extremely challenging circumstances. I can also be patient and wait for what God would want for me. I can wait for a God story because God has already proven that he's absolutely for me in this life. Does that make sense? All right, we have I just felt a burden to pray for two different kinds of people in response. So one would just be people who feel like they need a boost of faith, and that's a lot of us. So if that's you and you just feel like, man, faith is kind of lagging right now, it's kind of weak, kind of feels dry or something like that, I would encourage you to get faith. So Hannah's going to be over there to pray for people, right, Hannah? Okay, Hannah's going to be available to pray for people. Well done. That's awesome. But some of you specifically, I think you just a burden to pray because you need faith to give up on something that the world wants for you in order to wait for a specific God story in your life. And you just think, I really need faith for that. I need patience. I need power to say no to something, a hard thing, and to wait for God's thing. And so I would just like to challenge you also to receive prayer. There'll be a few other people ready to pray for you. Really practically, what I want us to do in response, there's paper over there and back there and back there. I want us to have a testimony of faith in our church. That would be awesome. We started a little bit of this at the fast, and that is writing down God's stories. And I would know that there's two different things we're going to write down. One is, has God done something in your life where you think, yeah, I waited for something and God came through and he did this. And I'm so grateful that God met me here in this way. That's a God story from the past. Could be like from 2 days ago or from 10 years ago. I don't care. I want us to write some God stories down. So what has God done for us? And then also what I want us to write down are basically just prayer points. I am waiting. I'm committing myself for this. I'm waiting for a God story about a spouse. I'm waiting for a God story about kids. I'm waiting for a God story about one of my children. I'm waiting for a God story in terms of a job. I'm waiting for a God story in terms of my housing, whatever it is. I'm waiting for God to show up, and I'm not going to settle. I'm not going to lower my standards as I wait. And so I just, in response, as we're praying, as we're singing, stuff like that, would you just make some time, or maybe even afterward, make some time over to the papers that are over there and write either a God story of something he has already done or a God story of something that you are committing to wait for, that we as a community can be praying for. Sound good? All right, so I'm just going to open us up in prayer, then Brooke will come up and we'll start just responding. So thank you, Lord. You're trustworthy, Jesus. As we get to know you more, we can trust you more and more. How could he who did not spare his own son not also graciously with him give us all things. We know it's true about you, Jesus, that you are lavishly, abundantly generous toward us on the cross, forgiving us before we even entered into the covenant. You forgave and loved and welcomed us in. We thank you for that, Lord. And we ask that you would just continue to build us up in faith as we learn to trust you more. As we get to know you, we love you. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.